In the heart of St. Mary Mead, a glittering gala unveils the sapphire of serendipity. But when curator Ernest Whitby vanishes into the shadows, a web of secrets unravels. A cunning rival, an ambitious assistant, a secretive donor, and a resentful guard. Each hides a motive. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom and keen eye, can unravel the clues. A cryptic note, a shard of red wax, a hidden trapdoor, and the whisper of a lost twin gem. In a race against time, will she expose the truth before the sapphire's secrets claim another victim? Chapter 1. The gala begins. The Ashford Museum, a modest but elegant edifice of red brick and ivy, stood at the heart of St. Mary Mead, its windows aglow with the promise of a splendid evening. It was the night of the grand gala, a celebration to unveil the sapphire of serendipity, a gem so rare it had drawn whispers of awe from London to the provinces. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of polished wood and fresh roses mingling with the murmur of well-dressed guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a velvet-upholstered chair near a marble bust of some forgotten scholar, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her knitting needles moved rhythmically, a soft click-click that blended into the hum of conversation, her eyes missing nothing. The museum's curator, Mr. Ernest Whitby, was a wiry man in his late 40s, with a scholar's stoop and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. He darted through the crowd like a hummingbird, his thin lips murmuring instructions to staff, his hands fluttering over the placement of a champagne flute or the angle of a spotlight. To Miss Marple, who had met him briefly at a village fete, he seemed a man perpetually on the edge of a crisis, his dedication to perfection both admirable and faintly pitiable. Tonight, his agitation was palpable. She noted how his gaze flicked to his pocket watch every few minutes, as if time itself were conspiring against him. The sapphire, displayed in a glass case at the room's center, was the evening cynosure. Its deep blue facets caught the chandelier's light, casting prismatic glints across the faces of the gathered. Lord Reginald Harrow, the gem's donor, held court nearby, his booming voice and aristocratic bearing drawing a small crowd of admirers. A man of 60, with silver hair and a hawkish nose, he spoke of the sapphire's origins in Ceylon with a proprietary pride that bordered on theatrical. Miss Marple, listening from her corner, found his tale curiously vague. Dates and names slipped through his narrative like sand through fingers. Among the throng, other figures stood out. Clara Morton, Whitby's assistant, moved with a purposeful grace, her dark hair pinned tightly, her eyes bright with ambition. She was young, perhaps 25, and her tailored dress suggested a taste beyond her means. Miss Marple noted how Clara's smile tightened when Whitby issued a sharp correction about the guest list. Tom Briggs, the head guard, loomed near the entrance, his broad shoulders straining against his uniform. His face, weathered by years and perhaps a touch of discontent, betrayed little, but Miss Marple observed how his hand lingered near his pocket, as if reassuring himself of something concealed. Then there was Dr. Victor Lang, a rival curator from a London museum, whose presence added a faint undercurrent of tension. Lean and impeccably dressed, with a sharp jaw and colder eyes, he stood apart, sipping his wine with a detached air. His museum had competed fiercely for the sapphire, and his attendance tonight seemed less celebratory than calculated. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, caught the brief, appraising glance he cast toward Whitby, a glance that held neither warmth nor goodwill. As the string quartet struck up a lively air, the room's energy swelled. Laughter rose, glasses clinked, and the sapphire gleamed like a captive star. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Whitby. At 9:30, she saw him pause near the exhibit hall's entrance, his face pale, his fingers twisting the watch chain. He murmured something to Clara, who nodded curtly, then slipped through a side door. The door closed with a soft thud, unnoticed by most, but to Miss Marple, it was as if a curtain had fallen on the first act of a drama. She adjusted her knitting, her mind already sifting through the threads of what was to come. People, she thought, are so very careless with their secrets. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. The Ashford Museum's Grand Hall, moments ago a tapestry of laughter and clinking glasses, fell into a stunned hush as the clock struck 10. The sapphire of serendipity, resplendent in its glass case, awaited its moment of unveiling, but the man tasked with its presentation, Mr. Ernest Whitby, was conspicuously absent. The string quartet faltered, their notes trailing into an uncertain pause, and the guests, a kaleidoscope of silk gowns and tailored suits, exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the marble bust, her knitting needles momentarily stilled, observed the ripple of disquiet with her characteristic clarity. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture and expression that betrayed more than words ever could. Clara Morton, the curator's assistant, stepped onto the small dais where Whitby was to have spoken. Her face, usually composed with the confidence of youth, was flushed, and her hands twisted nervously at the hem of her dress. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice catching, "I'm afraid Mr. Whitby has been delayed. Please enjoy the evening, and we shall proceed shortly." Her words, meant to reassure, only deepened the unease. A murmur rose, like the hum of bees disturbed, and Miss Marple noted how Clara's eyes darted toward the exhibit hall's side door, through which Whitby had vanished some 30 minutes prior. Lord Reginald Harrow, the sapphire's donor, was the first to break the silence with authority. "This is outrageous," he declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. His silver hair caught the chandelier's light as he strode toward Clara, his cane tapping sharply on the polished floor. "Where is the man? This is his moment, and he's nowhere to be found." His indignation, Miss Marple observed, was tinged with something else, a flicker of unease, perhaps, or calculation. She recalled his absence during a portion of the quartet's performance, a gap of some 10 minutes when his commanding presence had been notably missing from the crowd. Tom Briggs, the head guard, stood near the main entrance, his burly frame a bulwark against the growing agitation. His face, weathered and impassive, betrayed little, but Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught the way his hand lingered near his pocket, as if reassuring himself of some hidden object. She made a mental note of his earlier claim to have been stationed at the entrance all evening. Yet a waiter's passing remark suggested Briggs had been seen near the storage vaults, a detail that did not align with his stated duties. Dr. Victor Lang, the rival curator from London, stood apart from the throng, his lean figure silhouetted against a tapestry depicting a medieval hunt. His cold eyes surveyed the scene with a detachment that Miss Marple found intriguing. She had overheard a snippet of his conversation with a guest earlier, a dry comment about the sapphire's questionable provenance. Now, as Clara faltered on the dais, Lang's lips curved into a thin smile, one that spoke less of amusement than of satisfaction. Miss Marple's knitting resumed, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Lang's presence, she mused, was no mere courtesy. It carried the weight of purpose. The museum's staff, sensing the evening's unraveling, moved to restore order. Waiters circulated with fresh trays of champagne, and the quartet struck up a tentative waltz. But the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Guests whispered in clusters, their eyes straying to the empty dais or the gleaming sapphire, which seemed to mock the absence of its keeper. Miss Marple, ever the observer of human nature, noted how quickly curiosity turned to suspicion. It's always the same, she thought. When something goes amiss, people look for someone to blame. It was Clara who first suggested action. "We must find Mr. Whitby," she said, her voice steadier now, though her hands still trembled. She beckoned to Briggs, who nodded gruffly and lumbered toward the exhibit hall. Lord Harrow, still fuming, insisted on accompanying them, his cane tapping with renewed vigor. Dr. Lang, uninvited but undeterred, followed, his polished shoes silent on the floor. Miss Marple, unnoticed by the group, slipped from her chair and trailed at a discreet distance, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders. She had no official role in this matter, but her curiosity, honed by years of unraveling village intrigues, was as sharp as ever. The exhibit hall, a cavernous space lined with artifacts from ancient Rome to Renaissance Italy, was dimly lit, the sapphire's case a beacon at its center. Briggs, with the authority of his position, checked the side doors, finding them locked. "No one's come through here," he growled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Clara, her face pale, pointed to a narrow corridor leading to the storage vaults. "He was heading that way earlier," she said, her words tumbling out. "I saw him go, just before 10. Miss Marple, lingering near a display of Etruscan pottery, noted the slight catch in Clara's voice, as if she were reciting a prepared line. Lord Harrow, impatient, demanded a thorough search. "The man can't have vanished into thin air," he snapped, his eyes scanning the hall as if expecting Whitby to materialize from behind a statue. Dr. Lang, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the sapphire's case. Miss Marple observed how his fingers twitched slightly, as if resisting an urge to reach out. She filed this away, along with the memory of his earlier comment about provenance. A gem, she knew, was more than a pretty stone. It was a magnet for greed, envy, and secrets. The search yielded nothing. The vaults, a labyrinth of crates and catalogued treasures, were empty of Whitby. Briggs reported that all exits were secure, the keys accounted for in Whitby's office. Clara, near tears, recounted her last interaction with the curator, a brief exchange about the guest list, followed by his abrupt departure toward the vaults. "He seemed distracted," she admitted, her eyes avoiding Lord Harrow's glare. Miss Marple, standing quietly, noted the absence of dust on Briggs's boots, a curious detail for a man supposedly patrolling the vault's gritty corridors. The police were summoned, and within the hour, Inspector Craddock arrived, his familiar face a comfort to Miss Marple. A man of methodical habits and a grudging respect for her insights, he took charge with quiet efficiency. The museum was locked down, guests confined to the grand hall, and a preliminary search organized. Craddock, after a brief consultation with Clara and Briggs, turned to Miss Marple, who had resumed her seat near the bust. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone half amused, half resigned, "I suppose you've already formed an opinion?" "Not an opinion, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Merely observations. People, you see, are rarely as careful as they think." She did not elaborate, but her mind was already at work, sifting through the evening's events. Whitby's agitation, Clara's ambition, Harrow's absence, Briggs's clean boots, and Lang's calculating smile. Each was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. Craddock's men searched the museum, their footsteps echoing through the silent halls. The guests, now restless, whispered theories. Whitby had fled with a hidden treasure, or perhaps he'd been overcome by nerves and collapsed somewhere. Miss Marple, however, dismissed these as fanciful. Whitby, for all his nervous energy, was a man of duty, not flight. Her thoughts turned to the sapphire, still gleaming in its case. The lock, she noted, was modern, requiring a key Whitby always carried on a chain. Why, then, would someone remove the curator and leave the gem untouched? The answer, she suspected, lay not in the sapphire itself, but in what it represented. As the police continued their search, Miss Marple slipped unnoticed into Whitby's office, a small room cluttered with papers and artifacts in progress. The desk, meticulously organized, held a single anomaly, a crumpled note half hidden beneath a stack of catalogs. She retrieved it with a deft movement, careful not to disturb the surrounding papers. The note, written in a precise hand, read, "Meet me at 9:45. Urgent. VL." The initials sent a spark through her mind. Victor Lang? The coincidence was too neat to ignore. She also noticed a smudge of red wax on the desk's edge, its texture glossy and distinct, unlike the utilitarian candles used by the staff. Tucking the note into her reticule, she returned to the grand hall, her expression as placid as ever. Back among the guests, tension had given way to speculation. Clara, now composed, circulated with a tray of canapes, her eyes darting to the police as they moved through the crowd. Lord Harrow, seated near the sapphire's case, was deep in conversation with a local magistrate, his voice lowered, but his gestures emphatic. Briggs, stationed once more at the entrance, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, his hand still hovering near his pocket. Dr. Lang, however, had vanished from the hall, and Miss Marple's inquiry to a waiter revealed he had stepped out for air. A curious choice on such a chilly night. Craddock approached her again, his notebook in hand. "No sign of him yet," he said, his brow furrowed. "The exits are locked, the windows secure. It's as if he's evaporated." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles clicking softly. "People don't evaporate, Inspector," she said. "They are moved, or they move themselves. The question is why and where." She did not mention the note or the wax, not yet. Craddock, accustomed to her reticence, sighed and moved on, leaving her to her thoughts. The gala, now a shadow of its former grandeur, limped on. The quartet played half-heartedly, and the guests, weary of waiting, began to drift toward the cloakroom. Miss Marple remained, her mind tracing the evening's events like a map. Whitby's disappearance, she knew, was no accident. The note, the wax, the suspect's behaviors, all pointed to a purpose, one she was determined to uncover. Human nature, she mused, is like a village, full of secrets if you know where to look. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the museum felt less like a place of celebration and more like a stage for a drama, yet to unfold. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her thoughts weaving a pattern only she could see. The sapphire gleamed, the suspects hovered, and somewhere Ernest Whitby waited, alive or otherwise, for the truth to find him. Chapter 3. The first clues. The Ashford Museum, now shrouded in the unease of Ernest Whitby's disappearance, felt less like a temple of history and more like a chessboard where unseen players maneuvered. The grand hall, though still lit by the chandelier's golden glow, had lost its festive air, replaced by a tension that hung as heavily as the tapestries on the walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more near the marble bust, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands, watched the scene with the patience of one accustomed to unraveling life's subtler knots. The police, under Inspector Craddock's direction, moved methodically, their questions to the guests eliciting a mix of impatience and nervous speculation. Yet Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere, her mind turning over the crumpled note and the smudge of red wax she had discovered in Whitby's office. The note, with its cryptic, "Meet me at 9:45. Urgent." VL lay tucked in her reticule, a silent accusation. The initials pointed to Dr. Victor Lang, the rival curator, but Miss Marple was too seasoned to leap to conclusions. People, she knew, were rarely so obliging as to leave their guilt plainly signed. The red wax, however, intrigued her more. It was not the sort used for sealing museum documents, which favored utilitarian black or gray. This wax was vivid, almost ceremonial, suggesting a private habit or a deliberate clue. She resolved to keep both discoveries close until their significance became clearer. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a case already spiraling beyond routine, approached her briefly. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "you've been uncommonly quiet. Seen anything we haven't?" His tone carried the grudging respect of a man who had learned not to underestimate her. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Only what everyone sees, Inspector, but perhaps I look a little longer." He nodded, accustomed to her cryptic replies, and returned to his men, who were now combing the exhibit hall for traces of Whitby. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the suspects, each a study in contrasts. Clara Morton, the assistant, had regained some composure and was assisting a constable with a list of guests, her handwriting precise but her movements quick, as if to outrun her own nerves. Lord Reginald Harrow, still bristling with indignation, stood near the sapphire's case, his cane tapping an impatient rhythm as he spoke to a junior officer. Tom Briggs, the guard, remained at his post by the entrance, his broad frame a barrier to the outside world, though Miss Marple noted again the curious cleanliness of his boots, untouched by the dust that coated the vault corridors. Dr. Lang, who had returned from his brief absence, leaned against a pillar, his expression one of studied indifference, though his fingers toyed with a silver cigarette case, betraying a restlessness Miss Marple found telling. Slipping away from the grand hall, Miss Marple made her way to Whitby's office. Once more, her steps soft on the polished floor. The police had not yet searched it thoroughly, focused as they were on the vaults and exits. The room, small and cluttered with scholarly chaos, smelled of old paper and ink. The desk, its surface a testament to Whitby's fastidiousness, held neatly stacked files, a fountain pen, and a small brass lamp. The smudge of red wax, still vivid on the desk's edge, caught her eye again. She bent closer, noting its texture. Smooth, glossy, as if freshly melted. A quick glance around revealed no candles or sealing kits, only a box of matches. Half-used, tucked behind a stack of catalogs. Her fingers, nimble despite her age, traced the desk's underside, where she had found the note. There, caught in a splinter of wood, was a tiny thread of navy wool, barely visible. She plucked it carefully, holding it to the light. It was fine, well made, unlike the coarser fabrics of the museum staff's uniforms. A gentleman's suit, perhaps? Or a lady's shawl? She tucked it beside the note, her mind cataloging possibilities. Whitby, she reasoned, had been here just before his disappearance, perhaps writing or reading that urgent summons. But why leave it crumpled, half hidden? Had he been interrupted, or was the note itself a lure? Returning to the grand hall, Miss Marple found the atmosphere grown more fractious. Guests, weary of confinement, pressed Craddock for release, their voices a chorus of entitlement. Clara, now free of her task, hovered near the sapphire's case, her eyes darting between the gem and the police. Miss Marple approached her, her manner gentle. "My dear," she said, "you must be dreadfully worried about Mr. Whitby. Such a dedicated man, isn't he?" Clara nodded, her lips tight. "He was. Is," she corrected hastily. "Always working, always checking details. I don't know what could have happened." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on her brow, despite the coolness of the room. "Did you see anyone with him before he went to the vaults?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "No one specific. He was talking to guests, then he said he needed to check something. I thought it was about the display." Her eyes flicked away, and Miss Marple, with her knack for reading silences, sensed an omission. "Of course," she said kindly, letting the moment pass. Clara's ambition, she mused, was a bright flame, but ambition could blind, as easily as it drove. Lord Harrow, meanwhile, had taken to pacing, his cane a staccato beat against the floor. Miss Marple observed him from her seat, noting how his eyes lingered on the sapphire, not with pride, but with a guarded intensity. She recalled his earlier vagueness about the gem's origins, and wondered if his donation was less an act of philanthropy than of strategy. Men of his stature, she knew from her village days, often hid their motives behind grand gestures. Had Whitby known something about the sapphire that Harrow preferred kept silent? Briggs, still at his post, caught her eye next. His stoic demeanor was a mask, but masks, Miss Marple knew, were made to slip. She approached him, her shawl slipping slightly to give her an air of harmless frailty. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "you must have eyes like a hawk, guarding all these treasures. Did you notice anything odd tonight, before Mr. Whitby went missing?" Briggs shifted, his hand brushing his pocket again. "Nothing out of the ordinary, ma'am," he said gruffly. "I was at the door, like always. Saw Mr. Whitby head to the vaults, that's all." His words were steady, but his eyes slid away, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush at his collar. "How reassuring," she said, smiling. "A guard's vigilance is so comforting." Dr. Lang, now rejoined by a glass of wine, was her final study. She found him near a display of Roman coins, his cigarette case now tucked away. "Doctor." "Lang?" she said, her voice soft. "You must find our little museum quaint compared to London's grandeur." He turned, his smile polite but cool. "It has its charms," he replied, "though the sapphire is the real draw. A pity about Whitby, most inconvenient." His tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the edge beneath it, like a blade hidden in silk. "Indeed," she said. "I suppose you and he discussed the gem's history? Such a fascinating piece." Lang's smile tightened. "Briefly," he said, "he was preoccupied." The pause was slight, but to Miss Marple it was a door ajar. As the police continued their search, finding no trace of Whitby, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The note, the wax, the thread, each was a fragment of a larger picture. Whitby's disappearance, she felt certain, was no impulsive act but a calculated move, tied to the sapphire or something it concealed. The suspects, each with their own shadows, circled the mystery like moths around a flame. Clara's ambition, Harrow's secrecy, Briggs's reticence, Lang's calculation, all were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. Craddock, passing by, paused once more. "We're checking the grounds now," he said. "No sign of forced entry, no blood, nothing. It's baffling." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting. "Baffling, yes," she said, "but not insoluble. People leave traces, Inspector, even when they try not to." She did not mention the note or the wax, nor the thread now nestled in her reticule. Those were her clues, to be shared only when the pattern was clear. For now, she watched and waited, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands, knowing that in St. Mary Mead, as in life, the truth was often hidden in plain sight. Chapter 4. The Suspects' Stories. The Ashford Museum, its grandeur now dimmed by the shadow of Ernest Whitby's disappearance, had become a stage for suspicion, its halls echoing with the low voices of police and the restless murmurs of detained guests. The sapphire of serendipity, still gleaming in its locked case, seemed to mock the chaos, its blue facets catching the light with an almost insolent calm. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more in her unobtrusive corner near the marble bust, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, watched the unfolding drama with the quiet intensity of one who understood that truth often hid in the spaces between words. The crumpled note, the smudge of red wax, and the navy wool thread tucked in her reticule were her private treasures, each a piece of a puzzle she was not yet ready to share. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a case that defied simple answers, had set up an impromptu interview room in a small anteroom off the grand hall. The guests, now weary and querulous, were released after cursory questioning, but the four key figures, Clara Morton, Lord Reginald Harrow, Tom Briggs, and Dr. Victor Lang, remained. Their presence requested, if not demanded, by the inspector. Miss Marple, though not officially involved, positioned herself near the anteroom's open door, her chair angled to catch the drift of voices. Her status as a harmless elderly lady, often overlooked, was her greatest asset, allowing her to listen where others might be dismissed. Clara Morton was the first to be questioned, her slim figure framed in the doorway as she entered, her hands clasped tightly before her. Craddock's voice, firm but not unkind, carried clearly. "Miss Morton, you were Mr. Whitby's assistant. When did you last see him, and what was his demeanor?" Clara's response was measured, her voice steady but with a faint tremor. "It was just before 10, Inspector. He was checking the guest list with me in the hall. He seemed distracted, more than usual. He said he needed to attend to something in the vaults and left through the side door." Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, noted the precision of Clara's words, as if rehearsed, and the way her eyes avoided Craddock's gaze, settling instead on the floor. "And you saw no one with him?" Craddock pressed. "No one," Clara replied. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought. The girl's ambition, so evident in her poised demeanor, might conceal more than nerves. Lord Harrow followed, his entrance announced by the sharp tap of his cane and a gust of indignation. "This is preposterous, Craddock," he began, his aristocratic drawl filling the room. "I'm a patron of this museum, not a suspect in some tawdry melodrama." Craddock, unruffled, asked for his movements during the gala. Harrow claimed to have been mingling with guests, charming the local gentry with tales of the sapphire's origins. "I was in the hall all evening," he said, save for a brief moment to step out for a cigar, hardly a crime. Miss Marple, listening, recalled his absence during the string quartet's second piece, a gap longer than a cigar would require. His hands, she noted, gripped the cane tightly, belying his bluster. "And Whitby?" Craddock asked. "Did you speak with him?" Harrow waved a dismissive hand. A word or two about the display. He was fussing, as always. The casual tone, Miss Marple thought, was too studied, as if Harrow were painting a picture of indifference. Tom Briggs, the head guard, entered next, his heavy tread echoing in the small room. His gruff voice carried a defensive edge as he recounted his evening. "I was at the main entrance, like I'm paid to be," he said. "Saw Mr. Whitby head toward the vaults around 9:30. Didn't think nothing of it. He's always poking about." Craddock pressed him on the exits, and Briggs insisted they were secure, the keys untouched in Whitby's office. Miss Marple, her eyes half closed, recalled the waiter's remark about seeing Briggs near the vaults, a detail at odds with his account. She also remembered his pristine boots, an anomaly in the dusty corridors he claimed to patrol. "Anyone else near the vaults?" Craddock asked. Briggs hesitated, then shook his head. "Not that I saw." The pause, brief but telling, lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a misplaced stitch. Dr. Victor Lang was the last, his polished demeanor a contrast to Briggs's roughness. He entered with a faint smile, as if amused by the proceedings, his silver cigarette case glinting as he set it on the table. "Doctor." "Lang," Craddock began, "you're a long way from London. What brought you here tonight?" Lang's reply was smooth, his voice clipped. "Professional curiosity, Inspector. The sapphire is a remarkable piece, and I wish to see it displayed." He admitted to a brief conversation with Whitby early in the evening, discussing the gem's history. "He was agitated," Lang said, "but that was his nature, wasn't it? Always fretting over details." When asked about his movements, Lang claimed to have been in the grand hall, save for a moment outside to clear his head. Miss Marple, listening, recalled his absence coinciding with Whitby's, and the thin smile he'd worn when Clara faltered on the dais. "Did you meet Whitby at 9:45? Craddock asked, his tone sharpening. Lang's smile didn't waver. "No, Inspector, I had no such appointment." The denial was too smooth, Miss Marple thought, like a river hiding sharp rocks beneath. As the interviews concluded, Craddock emerged, rubbing his temples. He spotted Miss Marple and approached, his expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "They all have stories," he said, "but none of them quite fit." "What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his. "People often say too much, Inspector, or too little. It's the gaps that matter." She did not mention the note with VL, or the red wax, nor the navy thread, but her mind was busy weaving them into the fabric of the case. Each suspect's story held a flaw. Clara's haste, Harrow's absence, Briggs's boots, Lang's composure, like cracks in a veneer. She rose, her shawl adjusted, and made her way to the grand hall, where the suspects had gathered, their interactions a study in tension. Clara, now organizing a tray of untouched canapes, avoided Harrow's gaze as he muttered about incompetence. Briggs, back at his post, watched the room with a scowl, his hand never far from his pocket. Lang, leaning against a pillar, lit a cigarette, the match's flare illuminating his sharp features. Miss Marple, settling into her chair, considered their stories against the backdrop of her clues. The note suggested a meeting, the wax a ritual or ruse, the thread a trace of someone's presence. Whitby's disappearance, she felt certain, was no accident, but a move in a game she was beginning to understand. The police, meanwhile, continued their search, their torches flashing through the museum's darkened corridors. The guests, now mostly departed, left a hollow silence, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards or the distant hum of Craddock's men. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the sapphire, still untouched in its case. Its lock, she knew, required Whitby's key, yet no one had tampered with it. The motive, then, lay elsewhere, perhaps in what Whitby knew, or what he guarded. People, she mused, her needles clicking, are so very careless with their truths, especially when they think they're clever. As the night deepened, the museum seemed to hold its breath, its secrets locked as tightly as the sapphire's case. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as ever, sat quietly, her knitting a cover for the intricate work of her thoughts. The suspects' stories, like pieces of a broken mirror, reflected only fragments of the truth. It was her task, she knew, to gather those fragments and make them whole. Chapter 5. The Sapphire's Secret. The Ashford Museum, its once vibrant gala now a fading memory, lay under the somber scrutiny of Inspector Craddock's men, their footsteps a muted counterpoint to the ticking of the grand hall's clock. The sapphire of serendipity, untouched in its glass case, gleamed with a quiet defiance, as if daring the onlookers to unravel the mystery of Ernest Whitby's disappearance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner near the marble bust, her knitting needles moving with their ceaseless rhythm, observed the scene, with a clarity undimmed by the late hour. The crumpled note with VL, the smudge of red wax, and the navy wool thread nestled in her reticule were fragments of a truth she was piecing together, each clue a stitch in a pattern only she could see. The police, having found no trace of Whitby in the vaults or grounds, had turned their attention to the museum's inner workings, their questions growing sharper as the night wore on. Miss Marple, however, felt the answer lay not in the empty corridors, but in the sapphire itself, or rather, in what it concealed. She rose, her shawl adjusted with care, and made her way to the display case, now guarded by a young constable, who nodded respectfully as she approached. The gem, a deep blue star in its velvet-lined prison, seemed to pulse with secrets. Its lock, modern and intricate, required a key Whitby always carried, a fact confirmed by Clara Morton's earlier statement. Yet the case was untouched, the sapphire secure. Why, then, remove the curator and leave the prize? Miss Marple's mind, honed by years of village intrigues, turned to the gem's history, sensing a thread beyond the obvious. She recalled Lord Harrow's vague account of the sapphire's origins in Ceylon, delivered with the flourish of a man accustomed to admiration. His words, polished but imprecise, had struck her as a performance, not a revelation. Now, standing before the gem, she wondered what he had omitted. A chance conversation earlier that evening with Miss Eglantine Price, the museum's librarian, and a woman of encyclopedic memory, offered a clue. Miss Price, over a cup of weak tea, had mentioned a rumor. The sapphire was one of a pair, the second lost decades ago in a murky transaction involving a colonial merchant. They called it the twin star, Miss Price had said, her eyes bright with gossip. Some say it's still out there, hidden by a collector. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, had filed the detail away, sensing its weight. Now, as she studied the sapphire, the idea of a twin gem took root. Could Whitby's disappearance be tied to this lost counterpart? Had he uncovered its whereabouts, or threatened to expose a secret tied to the pair? She turned from the case, her gaze sweeping the grand hall. Clara Morton, now assisting a constable with a map of the museum, seemed subdued, her earlier agitation replaced by a brittle efficiency. Lord Harrow, seated near a display of Greek vases, was deep in conversation with a local dignitary, his gestures expansive, but his eyes wary. Tom Briggs, still at his post by the entrance, watched the room with a scowl, his hand brushing his pocket in a gesture Miss Marple found increasingly curious. Dr. Victor Lang, leaning against a pillar, sipped a fresh glass of wine, his sharp features softened by the chandelier's light, but his expression unreadable. Miss Marple approached Miss Price, who lingered near a bookshelf, her spectacles glinting as she catalogued stray programs from the gala. "Miss Price," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "you mentioned the sapphire's twin earlier. Do you recall any details about its loss?" Miss Price, delighted to share her knowledge, leaned closer. "Oh yes," she said. "It was in the 1890s, during the colonial troubles. The merchant, a Mr. Carver, sold one gem to a British lord, Harrow's ancestor, they say, but the other vanished. Some claimed Carver hid it, others that it was stolen. Mr. Whitby was researching it, you know. He'd found papers in the archives, something about a collector in London." Her voice dropped. He was quite excited, but secretive. Didn't want Lord Harrow to know. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How interesting," she said. "And did he mention anyone else? A colleague, perhaps?" Miss Price shook her head. "Only that he'd written to a museum in London for records. I don't know which." The mention of London sent a spark through Miss Marple's mind. Dr. Lang's museum, struggling financially, would leap at the chance to claim a second sapphire. Had Whitby's inquiries reached him, stirring ambition or fear? She thanked Miss Price, her mind racing as she returned to her seat. The sapphire's twin, she reasoned, was a prize worth far more than its monetary value. To Harrow, it might threaten his legacy, tied as it was to his family's name. To Lang, it could be salvation for his failing institution. To Clara, ambitious and eager, it might represent a chance to eclipse her mentor. Even Briggs, with his guarded demeanor, could be swayed by such a treasure, especially if his rumored debts were pressing. Miss Marple's needles clicked as she considered each suspect, their motives intertwining like threads in her knitting. Inspector Craddock, emerging from the anteroom, approached her, his notebook bulging with notes. "We've checked the archives and Whitby's quarters," he said, his voice heavy. "Nothing, no signs of a struggle, no ransom note. It's as if he walked into thin air." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. "Thin air, Inspector, is rarely as empty as it seems. Have you considered what Mr. Whitby knew, rather than where he went?" Craddock frowned, sensing her meaning, but unable to grasp it fully. "You're thinking of the sapphire?" he asked. "It's still here, locked tight." Miss Marple smiled. "Exactly, Inspector, which makes one wonder what else might be at stake." She did not mention the note, the wax, or the thread, nor Miss Price's tale of the twin star. These were her pieces, to be played when the board was clearer. Instead, she turned her attention to the suspects, now scattered across the hall. Clara, finishing with the constable, moved toward the exhibit hall, her steps purposeful, but her hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple, curious, followed at a distance, her steps muffled by the thick carpet. Clara paused near a display of medieval manuscripts, her fingers brushing the glass as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple, lingering behind a statue, noted the girl's quick glance over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Returning to the hall, Miss Marple caught sight of Lord Harrow, now alone, his cane resting across his knees. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic confidence, was drawn, his eyes fixed on the sapphire's case. She approached, her manner disarming. "Lord Harrow," she said, "the sapphire is quite magnificent. You must be proud to share it with Saint Mary Mead." Harrow started, then recovered with a forced smile. "Indeed, Miss Marple, a family heirloom, you know, though its history is complicated." His hesitation was brief, but Miss Marple caught it. "Complicated histories are often the most fascinating," she said, her tone light. "Did Mr. Whitby share your enthusiasm for its origins?" Harrow's smile tightened. "He was thorough, I'll give him that. Too thorough, perhaps." He rose abruptly, excusing himself, and Miss Marple watched him go, his cane tapping a staccato rhythm. Briggs, still at the entrance, was her next focus. She approached, her shawl slipping to give her an air of harmless frailty. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "you must find these events most unsettling. Did Mr. Whitby often visit the vaults so late?" Briggs's scowl deepened, but he answered gruffly. "Sometimes. He liked checking things himself. Didn't trust us much." His hand brushed his pocket again, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the gesture. "A cautious man," she said. "And you saw nothing unusual near the vaults?" Briggs shook his head too quickly. "Nothing, ma'am." She smiled, thanking him, but the memory of his clean boots lingered, a detail that refused to fit. Dr. Lang, now conversing with a constable, caught her eye last. His composure was intact, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers toyed with his cigarette case, a nervous habit at odds with his cool demeanor. She did not approach him, sensing he would reveal little under direct scrutiny. Instead, she returned to her seat, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The sapphire's twin, she thought, was the key. Not the gem in the case, but the one lost, hidden, desired. Whitby's research, Miss Price's gossip, the note's initials, all pointed to a secret worth silencing. People, she mused, are so very eager to guard what they cannot bear to lose. As the clock struck 1, the museum seemed to settle into an uneasy truce, its secrets locked as tightly as the sapphire's case. Miss Marple, her mind weaving connections, sat quietly, her needles a soft metronome. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the motives and missteps of those around her. Chapter 6. Shadows in the Vaults. The Ashford Museum, its grandeur now cloaked in the stillness of the early hours, seemed to hold its breath as the mystery of Ernest Whitby's disappearance deepened. The grand hall, once alive with music and laughter, was now a hushed arena where Inspector Craddock's men moved with quiet purpose, their torches casting fleeting shadows across ancient artifacts. The sapphire of serendipity, secure in its glass case, gleamed with an almost mocking serenity, its presence a silent challenge to unravel the curator's fate. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles stilled for the moment, stood near the entrance to the exhibit hall, her shawl drawn close against the chill of the night. The crumpled note with VL the smudge of red wax, the navy wool thread, and the whispered tale of the sapphire's twin were threads in her mind, each pulling her toward a truth she sensed was near. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with fatigue, had expanded the search to the museum's lower levels, where the storage vaults lay like a warren beneath the polished floors. Miss Marple, with the unobtrusive air of a village spinster, had secured his permission to accompany a small party to the vaults, citing a wish to understand the museum's workings. Craddock, accustomed to her quiet persistence, agreed, though his raised eyebrow suggested he knew her interest was far from casual. She followed a young constable, her steps measured, her eyes alert to every detail in the dim corridors. The vaults, reached by a narrow staircase behind a locked door, were a labyrinth of crates, shelves, and catalogued treasures, their air thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. The constable's torch swept across rows of labeled boxes, Etruscan pottery, medieval manuscripts, fragments of Roman mosaics, each a testament to Whitby's meticulous care. Miss Marple, her gaze sharp behind her spectacles, noted the orderliness of the space, marred only by a faint disturbance near a stack of crates. A crate, labeled Temporary Holdings, was slightly askew, its lid not fully secured. She paused, her fingers brushing the wood, and found a faint scuff mark on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. "Constable," she said softly, "might you shine your light here?" The young man obliged, revealing a trap door beneath the crate, its edges barely visible in the stone floor. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning below. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "How curious," she murmured. The constable, startled, called for Craddock, who arrived with a frown, his notebook already open. "What's this, Miss Marple?" he asked, crouching to examine the trapdoor. "A cellar, perhaps?" she suggested. "Mr. Whitby might have had reason to explore it." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he signaled for two officers to lift the crate aside. The trapdoor, heavy and iron-bound, creaked as it was opened, revealing a steep staircase descending into shadow. Craddock hesitated, then turned to Miss Marple. "Stay here, please. This could be dangerous." She nodded, her compliance masking her intent to observe every detail. As the officers descended, their torches flickering, she lingered near the trapdoor, her ears attuned to the muffled sounds below. Her mind returned to the clues, the note summoning Whitby to a meeting, the red wax suggesting a deliberate act, the navy thread hinting at an unseen presence. The trapdoor, she suspected, was no mere storage access, but a pathway to the heart of the mystery. While the police explored below, Miss Marple turned her attention to the vault's contents. Near the trapdoor, a crate marked Lang Collection caught her eye, its label in a crisp, modern font unlike the museum's older tags. She recalled Miss Price's mention of Whitby's correspondence with a London museum. Could it be Lang's? The crate's contents, obscured by a tarp, were inaccessible without tools, but its presence was a thread she could not ignore. Dr. Lang's museum, rumored to be in financial straits, would have much to gain from a discovery like the sapphire's twin. Had Whitby's research threatened to expose or claim it? She stepped back, her gaze sweeping the vault. A glint near the scuff mark drew her attention, a shard of red wax, its glossy texture matching the smudge on Whitby's desk. She retrieved it with a handkerchief, careful not to disturb its edges, and tucked it beside the note and thread in her reticule. The wax, she mused, was no accident. It was a signature, perhaps of habit or intent. Her thoughts turned to Lang, whose cigarette case and polished demeanor suggested a man of precise rituals. Could the wax be his, a relic of a letter sealed in haste, or a trap laid for Whitby? Craddock returned, his face grim. "The cellar's empty," he reported, "but it leads to a passage under the museum. Old, likely from when this was a manor house. It's a maze down there. Could take hours to search." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A passage offered an escape route or a hiding place, but for whom? Whitby or his captor? "Did you find anything else, Inspector?" she asked, her tone mild. He shook his head. "Just dust and cobwebs. No sign of Whitby." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Inspector, it's what isn't there that matters most." Returning to the grand hall, Miss Marple found the suspects under varying degrees of strain. Clara Morton, now seated near a display of Renaissance sketches, was pale, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Lord Harrow, pacing near the Sapphire's case, muttered about the scandal's impact on his reputation. Tom Briggs at his post seemed more restless, his eyes darting to the exhibit hall's entrance. Dr. Lang, however, was absent, and a quick inquiry to a constable revealed he had stepped out again, claiming a need for fresh air. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Lang's absences, she noted, were as calculated as his presence. She approached Clara, her manner gentle. "My dear," she said, "these vaults must be quite a responsibility for you and Mr. Whitby. Did he often work there late?" Clara started, her eyes wary. "Sometimes," she said. "He was cataloging new acquisitions. He didn't always tell me what." Her voice held a defensive edge, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on her cheeks. "Of course," she said, "but he trusted you, didn't he? A capable assistant is so valuable." Clara's smile was tight. "I tried to be," she said, and Miss Marple sensed a flicker of guilt, or perhaps resentment, beneath the words. Turning to Harrow, Miss Marple adopted a deferential air. "Lord Harrow," she said, "this must be distressing, with the sapphire so central to your generosity. Did Mr. Whitby ever mention other gems, perhaps related to this one?" Harrow's eyes narrowed, but he answered smoothly. "He was always digging into old records. Tiresome habit, really. The sapphire's history is clear enough. My family's had it for generations." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hand as he gripped his cane. "Naturally," she said, "though history has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Briggs, when approached, was less forthcoming. "Mr. Briggs," Miss Marple said, "these vaults must be a challenge to guard. Did you ever notice Mr. Whitby meeting anyone there?" Briggs's scowl deepened. "I don't pry into his business," he said. "I check the doors, that's all." His hand brushed his pocket again, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the gesture, wondering what he concealed. "A dutiful guard," she said, smiling. "So reassuring." Lang's return to the hall, his face composed but his tie slightly askew, drew her attention last. She did not approach him, sensing his wariness, but watched as he lit another cigarette, the match's flare illuminating the same sharp features she'd noted earlier. The red wax, the Lang collection crate, his museum's troubles, all pointed to a man with much to gain or lose. People, she mused, returning to her seat, are so very revealing when they think they're not. The clock struck 2, its chimes a somber reminder of time's passage. Craddock, conferring with his men, looked increasingly frustrated, the cellar's passages yielding no answers. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, felt the pieces aligning. The trapdoor, the wax, the crate, the twin gem. Whitby's disappearance, she was certain, was tied to a secret he had unearthed, one that threatened someone in this room. Her needles clicked, a steady rhythm against the museum's silence as she waited for the next thread to emerge. Chapter 7. The Assistant's Ambition. The Ashford Museum, now steeped in the weary hush of the early morning, seemed to pulse with secrets, its corridors and artifacts bearing silent witness to the enigma of Ernest Whitby's disappearance. The grand hall, its chandelier dimmed to a faint glow, held only a handful of figures. Inspector Craddock's men, their faces drawn with fatigue, and the 4 key suspects, each tethered to the mystery by threads of motive and opportunity. The sapphire of serendipity, locked in its glass case, gleamed with a cold indifference, as if untouched by the human drama unfolding around it. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more near the marble bust, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, relentless rhythm, observed the scene with a clarity that cut through the fog of uncertainty. The crumpled note with VL, the red wax shard, the navy wool thread, and the trap door in the vaults were pieces of a puzzle she was steadily assembling, each clue sharpened by the whispered tale of the sapphire's lost twin. The police, having found no trace of Whitby in the cellar's passages, had returned to questioning staff and reviewing the museum's security logs. Miss Marple, however, felt the truth lay closer, in the interplay of those left behind. Clara Morton, the young assistant, drew her attention now. Clara's poised exterior, so carefully maintained during the gala, had begun to fray, her movements jerky as she sorted papers near a display of Venetian glass. Her ambition, evident in her sharp eyes and tailored dress, was a flame Miss Marple recognized from her village days, bright, consuming, and potentially dangerous. Could it have driven her to act against her mentor? Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping slightly to enhance her air of harmless frailty, and approached Clara, who started at the sound of her name. "Miss Morton," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "You must be quite exhausted helping with all this. Mr. Whitby was fortunate to have so capable an assistant." Clara's smile was tight, her eyes flickering with unease. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained. "I only wish I could do more to find him." Her fingers twisted the edge of a paper, and Miss Marple noted a glint at her throat. A new brooch, its emerald stones catching the light, far too costly for an assistant's salary. "How thoughtful of you," Miss Marple said, settling into a nearby chair as if to rest. "You worked closely with Mr. Whitby, I imagine. Did he share his plans for the gala or perhaps his recent research?" Clara hesitated, her gaze darting to the sapphire's case. "He was always busy," she said, "cataloging, researching, checking the displays. He didn't tell me everything." Her words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her voice, as if guarding a half-truth. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm. "But you must have overheard something, working so closely. A man like Mr. Whitby, so dedicated, might let slip a detail or two." Clara's flush deepened, and she busied herself with the papers. "Well," she said, after a pause, "I did hear him arguing with someone a few days ago, in his office, after hours. It was about the sapphire, something about its provenance. I didn't catch much, but it was heated." Miss Marple's eyes brightened behind her spectacles. "How intriguing," she said. "And do you know who it was?" Clara shook her head too quickly. I couldn't see. I was passing by, tidying up." Her fingers tightened on the papers, and Miss Marple noted the lie in her avoidance. "Naturally," she said, her tone gentle. "But you'd recognize the voice, perhaps?" Clara's eyes met hers, then slid away. "It might have been Dr. Lang," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard him mention London and something about records. Mr. Whitby was upset, said it wasn't his place to interfere." Miss Marple nodded, her mind slotting this into place. Lang, with his struggling museum and keen interest in the sapphire, had reason to challenge Whitby's findings, especially if they touched on the twin star. But Clara's hesitation suggested more, perhaps a desire to deflect suspicion or a fear of revealing her own involvement. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice conspiratorial. "My dear, ambition is a fine thing, but it can lead one astray. Did Mr. Whitby ever speak of promoting you, or perhaps of others who envied his position?" Clara's face paled, and the brooch at her throat seemed to weigh heavier. "He said I had potential," she said, her voice small. "But he was particular. He didn't trust easily." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "Trust is so delicate, isn't it? Like a fine thread, easily broken." Clara nodded, her expression troubled, and excused herself to assist a constable, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The brooch, Miss Marple mused, was a clue in itself. Its cost suggested a benefactor, or perhaps a reward. Could Clara have been tempted by an offer, money, status, or the promise of Whitby's role? Her admission about the argument, though, pointed to Lang, whose motives were growing clearer. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the note with VL, the red wax, and the crate labeled Lang Collection in the vaults. The pieces were aligning, but Clara's role, whether pawn or player, remained uncertain. In the grand hall, Lord Harrow was now engaged in a heated exchange with Craddock, his cane jabbing the air as he demanded progress. "This is a disgrace," he said, his voice carrying. "Whitby's absence tarnishes my gift to this town." Miss Marple, watching from her seat, noted the theatricality of his outrage, as if crafted to deflect scrutiny. His brief absence during the gala, coupled with his reticence about the sapphire's history, suggested a man guarding more than his reputation. Tom Briggs, still at the entrance, was a study in suppressed tension, his hand lingering near his pocket. Miss Marple, recalling his clean boots and the waiter's claim of seeing him near the vaults, wondered what he concealed. A key, perhaps, or something more incriminating? She made a mental note to inquire further, but discreetly. Knowing his gruff exterior hid a wariness that could turn hostile. Dr. Lang, meanwhile, had returned to his post by the pillar, his cigarette case glinting as he lit another match. His absence during the vault search had not escaped Miss Marple's notice, nor had his calm, almost amused demeanor. She recalled Miss Price's mention of Whitby's London correspondence, likely with Lang's museum. If Whitby had traced the twin star, Lang's interest would be more than academic. It would be desperate. The red wax, she suspected, was his hallmark, a detail as telling as a signature. Craddock approached, his notebook dog-eared from use. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone weary, "we're chasing shadows. The cellar's a dead end, and the suspect's stories don't add up. Any thoughts?" She tilted her head, her needles pausing. "Shadows, Inspector, often hide substance. Have you considered what Mr. Whitby might have known that made him a threat?" Craddock frowned. "You think this is about the sapphire?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Or what it leads to. Secrets, you see, are rarely singular. She did not share her clues, the note, the wax, the thread, or Clara's revelation, but her mind was weaving them into a pattern. The trapdoor, the crate, the argument with Lang, all pointed to a motive rooted in the sapphire's twin. Clara's ambition, though, was a wild card. Had she merely overheard, or had she acted, lured by the promise of advancement or wealth? Miss Marple's needles resumed, their rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. People, she mused, are so very transparent when they think they're opaque. As the clock neared 3, the museum's silence was broken only by the occasional murmur of police and the creak of floorboards. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady anchor, felt the truth drawing closer, hidden in the ambitions and secrets of those around her. Clara's brooch, Lang's wax, Harrow's bluster, Briggs's reticence, each was a stitch in the tapestry, and she was determined to see it whole. Chapter 8. The Donor's Disdain. The Ashford Museum, now cloaked in the heavy stillness of the pre-dawn hours, seemed to cradle its secrets as tightly as the sapphire of serendipity in its locked case. The grand hall, its chandelier casting a muted glow, held only the faint rustle of police activity and the occasional murmur of the remaining suspects, each a silhouette against the weight of Ernest Whitby's absence. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar nook near the marble bust, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, deliberate rhythm, observed the scene with a mind as sharp as ever. The crumpled note with VL, the shard of red wax, the navy wool thread, the trap-door in the vaults, and Clara Morton's whispered admission of an overheard argument were threads in a tapestry she was weaving, each stitch bringing her closer to the truth. The tale of the sapphire's twin, gleaned from Miss Price, lingered in her thoughts, a shadow behind the gleaming gem. Lord Reginald Harrow, the sapphire's donor, had become a focal point of her attention. His aristocratic presence, marked by the sharp tap of his cane and the commanding sweep of his silver hair, had dominated the gala. Yet his indignation at Whitby's disappearance seemed to Miss Marple less a reaction to loss than a performance to deflect scrutiny. His brief absence during the quartet's performance, his vague account of the sapphire's origins, and his guarded response to questions about Whitby's research suggested a man with secrets to protect. Could the twin star, rumored to be lost, be the key to his unease? Miss Marple, her shawl adjusted to enhance her air of harmless curiosity, approached Lord Harrow as he sat near a display of Greek amphorae, his cane resting across his knees. His face, usually a mask of patrician confidence, was drawn, his eyes fixed on the sapphire's case with an intensity that belied his earlier bluster. "Lord Harrow," she said, her voice soft and deferential, "this must be a dreadful shock, with your generous gift at the heart of such a mystery. The sapphire is truly magnificent." Harrow turned, his expression softening into a practiced smile. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said, his tone warm but measured. "A family treasure, brought to light for the benefit of St. Mary Mead. Whitby's absence is most unfortunate." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a nearby chair as if to rest her weary bones. "How kind of you to share it," she said. "I understand Mr. Whitby was quite thorough in researching its history. Did he ever mention anything curious about it? Perhaps a companion gem?" Harrow's hand tightened on his cane, a fleeting gesture Miss Marple did not miss. "Whitby was always poking into old records," he said, his voice dismissive. "He found nothing of consequence. The sapphire's history is well documented. My great-grandfather acquired it in Ceylon, a straightforward transaction. His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his fingers, a crack in his polished facade. "Straightforward, of course," she said, her needles clicking softly. "Though old treasures often carry whispers of other stories, don't they? I heard a rumor of a second sapphire, lost long ago. Such a find would be remarkable, wouldn't it?" Harrow's smile stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Rumors, Miss Marple, are the province of idle minds. There's only one sapphire, and it's here, under lock and key." He gestured toward the case, but his gaze lingered on it, as if seeing something beyond its glass. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Of course," she said. "Though Mr. Whitby's curiosity must have been trying at times, did he ever share his findings with you?" Harrow's jaw tightened, and he rose, his cane tapping sharply. "He was a curator, not a confidant," he said. "His job was to display the gem, not to invent fantasies about it. If you'll excuse me, I must speak with Inspector Craddock." He strode off, his posture rigid, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his unease. His denial of the twin star was too emphatic, his departure too abrupt. Men of his stature, she knew from her village observations, often hid their fears behind a veneer of disdain. Returning to her seat, Miss Marple considered Harrow's role. His family's connection to the sapphire, stretching back generations, gave him a stake in its legacy. If Whitby had uncovered evidence of the twin star, perhaps its location or a scandal tied to its loss, Harrow's reputation or his family's might be at risk. His absence during the gala, though brief, was long enough for a discreet act, perhaps a confrontation in the vaults. The navy wool thread, she recalled, could belong to a fine suit like Harrow's, though it was too early to be certain. In the grand hall, the other suspects moved like pieces on a board. Clara Morton, now conferring with a constable near the exhibit hall, seemed subdued, her costly brooch a silent question mark. Miss Marple wondered if Harrow, with his wealth, might have been its source, perhaps to secure her loyalty or silence. Tom Briggs, stationed at the entrance, was a study in restless vigilance, his hand brushing his pocket yet again. His clean boots, at odds with his claimed duties, suggested he had avoided the dusty vaults, or had been elsewhere entirely. Dr. Victor Lang, leaning against a pillar, lit another cigarette, the flare of his match illuminating his sharp features. His absences, his crate in the vaults, and the red wax linked him to the note. But Miss Marple sensed his motive was tied to acquisition, not legacy. Inspector Craddock, emerging from the anteroom, approached her, his notebook heavy with scribbled notes. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with exasperation. "We've searched every corner, even that blasted cellar. No Whitby, no signs of a struggle. It's as if he's vanished into the ether." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. "Ether, Inspector, is a convenient excuse for what we don't yet see. Have you considered Mr. Whitby's research? He was a man of details, and details can be dangerous." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think this is about the sapphire's history?" She smiled faintly. "Or what it conceals. Men like Lord Harrow guard their legacies fiercely, don't they?" She did not mention the note, the wax, the thread, or Clara's revelation about the argument with Lang. Nor did she speak of the twin star, though its shadow loomed large. Instead, she watched as Craddock returned to his men, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an unsolved case. The grand hall, now nearly empty of guests, felt like a stage after. The curtains fall, its players waiting for their cues. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Harrow, now speaking with a constable, his gestures sharp and authoritative. His disdain, she thought, was a shield, but shields could crack. The clock struck 4, its chimes a somber reminder of time's relentless march. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, felt the pieces aligning, the trapdoor's promise of a hidden path, the wax's link to Lang, the thread's hint of presence, and now Harrow's guarded fear of Whitby's discoveries. The twin star, she suspected, was more than a rumor. It was a motive, one that could drive a man like Harrow to desperate measures. People, she mused, her needles clicking, are so very protective of their pride, especially when it's built on secrets. As the museum settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat, her mind weaving the threads of the case. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the motives and missteps of those around her. Harrow's disdain, Clara's ambition, Briggs's reticence, Lang's calculation, each was a stitch in the pattern, and she was determined to see it complete. Chapter 9. The Guard's Grudge. The Ashford Museum, its once lively halls now steeped in the heavy silence of the early morning, seemed to guard its secrets as fiercely as the sapphire of serendipity in its locked case. The grand hall, lit only by the chandelier's faint glow, was a stage of shadows, where Inspector Craddock's men moved with weary determination, their searches yielding no trace of Ernest Whitby. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the marble bust, her knitting needles tracing their familiar rhythm, observed the scene with a clarity that pierced the gloom. The crumpled note with VL, the shard of red wax, the navy wool thread, the trapdoor in the vaults, Clara Morton's whispered confession of an overheard argument, and Lord Harrow's guarded disdain were threads in her tapestry, each drawing her closer to the truth. The rumor of the sapphire's twin, a lost gem tied to a murky past, loomed large, its shadow cast over every suspect. Tom Briggs, the head guard, drew her attention now. His burly figure, stationed at the main entrance, was a constant in the night's chaos, yet his gruff demeanor and restless gestures betrayed a tension Miss Marple found telling. His clean boots at odds with the dusty vault corridors he claimed to patrol, and the waiter's remark, placing him near the vaults before Whitby's disappearance, suggested a discrepancy she could not ignore. His hand, perpetually brushing his pocket, hinted at something concealed, a key, a note, or perhaps a token of guilt. Miss Marple, her shawl adjusted to enhance her air of harmless curiosity, resolved to probe further, sensing that Briggs's reticence masked a grudge that might unlock the mystery. She approached him, her steps soft on the polished floor, her expression one of mild concern. "Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice gentle, "you must be dreadfully tired, standing guard through all this turmoil. It's a heavy responsibility, protecting such treasures." Briggs's scowl softened slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "It's my job, ma'am," he said gruffly. "Been doing it for years." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a nearby chair as if to ease her weary limbs. "Of course," she said, her needles clicking softly. "Mr. Whitby must have relied on you greatly. Did he ever confide in you about his work, or perhaps his concerns?" Briggs shifted, his hand brushing his pocket again, a gesture Miss Marple noted with care. "He wasn't one for confiding," he said, his voice low. "Always fussing, checking locks, counting artifacts. Didn't trust us guards much. Thought we'd nick something." His tone carried a bitter edge, and Miss Marple's eyes brightened behind her spectacles. "How trying," she said sympathetically. "It must be difficult, working under such scrutiny. Did he ever mention anything specific, say, about the sapphire or its history?" Briggs's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the grand hall, where Clara Morton was sorting papers and Lord Harrow was speaking with a constable. "He was always on about that gem," he said. "Said it had secrets, things he was looking into. Didn't tell me what, but he was jumpy lately, like he expected trouble." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. "Trouble? How fascinating. Did you notice anyone unusual near the vaults? Perhaps someone he might have met?" Briggs's eyes flickered, and he shook his head. "Didn't see nothing. I was at my post, like I said." His words were firm, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, as if he were guarding a half-truth. She smiled, her tone disarming. "Of course, a guard's vigilance is so reassuring, though I imagine the vaults are quite a maze. Did you ever patrol them with Mr. Whitby?" Briggs's scowl returned, and he shifted his weight. "Sometimes," he said. "He liked to check things himself, but I'd walk the corridors. Nothing out of place last night?" Miss Marple nodded, though her mind lingered on his clean boots and the waiter's claim. "And the keys?" she asked lightly. "Mr. Whitby kept them secure, I presume?" Briggs's hand twitched toward his pocket, then fell. "In his office, always," he said. "I don't touch 'em." His voice was too sharp, and Miss Marple filed the reaction away, a stitch in her growing pattern. As she thanked him and turned away, her thoughts turned to a conversation she'd overheard earlier between a maid and a constable. The maid, a nervous girl named Lily, had mentioned Briggs's gambling debts, a local rumor that painted him as a man under pressure. She'd also whispered of an incident months ago when Whitby had caught Briggs near the exhibit hall after hours, a breach that earned him a stern reprimand. Miss Marple, her memory as sharp as her needles, recalled Lily's final remark. "He's been sour ever since, muttering about the curator like he'd a score to settle." A grudge, Miss Marple mused, could be a powerful motive, especially if paired with desperation. In the grand hall, the other suspects moved in their orbits of unease. Clara, her costly brooch glinting as she sorted papers, seemed to avoid Briggs's gaze, as if wary of his presence. Lord Harrow, now pacing near the sapphire's case, cast occasional glances toward the entrance, his cane tapping a restless rhythm. Dr. Victor Lang, leaning against a pillar, lit another cigarette, the flare of his match illuminating his sharp features. Miss Marple noted his calm, almost amused demeanor, but her thoughts kept returning to the red wax and the Lang collection crate in the vaults. Briggs's grudge, though, was a new thread, one that could tie to the others in unexpected ways. She made her way to Inspector Craddock, who was conferring with a sergeant near the exhibit hall. His face, lined with exhaustion, brightened slightly at her approach. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're still here, knitting away. Any insights for a weary inspector?" She smiled, her needles clicking. "Only that people, Inspector, are rarely as simple as they seem. Mr. Briggs, for instance, such a dutiful guard, yet perhaps not entirely content with his lot." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think he's involved?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I think, Inspector, that discontent can lead to curious actions. Have you checked the service doors near the vaults? They might tell a story." Craddock, sensing her direction, nodded and dispatched a constable to investigate. Miss Marple, returning to her seat, learned later that one service door, tucked behind a stack of crates, had a lock recently oiled, its hinges free of rust. No dust marred its threshold, suggesting recent use. The discovery sent a spark through her mind, an escape route, or an entry, perhaps used by Briggs, or someone he allowed passage. His clean boots, his pocket, his bitterness, all pointed to a man who might have acted, whether for gain or revenge. Her thoughts returned to the other suspects. Clara's ambition and her costly brooch suggested a connection to wealth, perhaps Harrow's. Lang's crate and the red wax tied him to the note and the twin stars' allure. Harrow's disdain masked a fear of exposure, his family's legacy at stake. Briggs, though, was the outlier, a man of action, not schemes, whose grudge could have turned to opportunity. Had he seen Whitby head to the vaults, perhaps lured by the note? Had he acted alone, or as a tool for another's design? The clock struck 5, its chimes a somber note in the quiet hall. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady anchor, felt the tapestry nearing completion. The trapdoor, the wax, the thread, the argument, the oiled lock. Each was a clue, and Briggs's grudge was a knot. That tied them together. People, she mused, carry their burdens so visibly, even when they think they're hidden. As the museum waited for dawn, she sat, her needles moving, her mind tracing the final threads of the mystery. Chapter 10. The Rival's Ruse. The Ashford Museum, its once vibrant halls now cloaked in the gray half-light of dawn, stood as a silent sentinel over the mystery of Ernest Whitby's disappearance. The grand hall, its chandelier dimmed to a ghostly flicker, held only the faint hum of Inspector Craddock's men, their searches growing more desperate as the hours stretched on. The sapphire of serendipity, locked in its glass case, gleamed with an unyielding calm, as if untouched by the human turmoil swirling around it. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner near the marble bust, her knitting needles tracing their ceaseless rhythm, observed the scene with a mind as sharp as a winter's edge. The crumpled note with VL, the shard of red wax, the navy wool thread, the trapdoor in the vaults, Clara Morton's whispered confession, Lord Harrow's guarded disdain, Tom Briggs's simmering grudge, and the oiled service door were threads in her tapestry, each drawing her closer to a truth she felt was within reach. The rumor of the sapphire's twin, a lost gem tied to a shadowed past, loomed ever larger, its allure a magnet for ambition and deceit. Dr. Victor Lang, the rival curator from London, had become a figure of increasing interest to Miss Marple. His polished demeanor, punctuated by the glint of his silver cigarette case and the thin smile that never reached his eyes, suggested a man of calculation, one whose presence at the gala was no mere courtesy. The note's initials, VL, the red wax matching his museum's letterhead, and the crate labeled Lang Collection. In the vaults, all pointed to him as a central player. His museum's financial woes, whispered about in academic circles, gave him a motive as sharp as his intellect. Miss Marple, her shawl adjusted to maintain her air of harmless curiosity, resolved to test the edges of his composure, sensing that his ruse, whatever it was, held the key to Whitby's fate. In the grand hall, Lang leaned against a pillar, his cigarette case open as he selected another cigarette, the flare of his match casting sharp shadows across his angular face. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft, her expression one of gentle interest. "Doctor." "Lang," she said, her voice mild. "You must find our little museum quite quaint compared to London's grandeur. Yet the sapphire has drawn you here, hasn't it? Lang turned, his smile polite but guarded. "It's a remarkable piece, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "A scholar's curiosity, you understand. Whitby's display was adequate, though his absence is most inconvenient." His tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of tension in his eyes, like a crack in a porcelain mask. "How kind of you to attend," she said, settling into a nearby chair, her needles clicking softly. "Mr. Whitby must have valued your expertise. Did you discuss the sapphire's history with him? I hear it has quite a tale." Lang's fingers paused on his cigarette case, a fleeting hesitation. "Briefly," he said. He was preoccupied with details, as curators often are. "We spoke of provenance, nothing more." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Provenance can be so revealing, can't it? I understand there's a rumor of a second sapphire lost long ago. Such a discovery would be a triumph for any museum." Lang's smile tightened, and he exhaled a slow plume of smoke. "Rumors, Miss Marple, are the currency of idle minds. Whitby was chasing shadows, nothing more." The mention of the red wax came to her lips, but she held it back, sensing he would deflect. Instead, she said, "I found a curious bit of wax in his office, quite vivid, not like the museum's usual sort. You don't use such wax for your correspondence, do you?" Lang's hand froze, the cigarette halfway to his lips, and for a moment his composure slipped, revealing a flash of unease. "Wax?" he said, recovering quickly. "I use candles for reading, nothing more. Museums are drafty places." His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the lie. The wax, identical to that on his museum's letterhead, was no candle's residue. It was a seal, a mark of intent. She smiled, her tone disarming. "Of course, how practical. Though Mr. Whitby's research must have been fascinating. Did he ever mention contacting your museum about old records?" Lang's eyes narrowed, but he answered smoothly. "He wrote once, asking about colonial archives. I sent a standard reply. Nothing significant." His dismissal was too casual, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he flicked ash from his cigarette. "How helpful," she said, rising as if fatigued. "Scholars must stick together, mustn't they?" Lang nodded, his smile returning, but Miss Marple saw the wariness beneath it, like a predator sensing a trap. Returning to her seat, she considered Lang's words against the evidence. The note with VL suggested a meeting at 9:45, just before Whitby vanished. The red wax, found in his office and near the trapdoor, matched Lang's museum's seal, a detail too precise to be coincidence. The crate in the vaults, labeled Lang Collection, hinted at his deeper involvement, perhaps a pretext to access the museum's underbelly. Whitby's research into the twin star, confirmed by Miss Price, would have threatened Lang's ambitions, especially if it promised to restore his museum's fortunes. Had Lang lured Whitby to the vaults, using the note as bait to silence him or extract his knowledge? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a discreet request from Craddock, who had secured permission to search Lang's hotel room a short distance from the museum. She shared her suspicion about the wax, withholding the note and thread for now, and suggested checking for sealing materials. Craddock, trusting her instincts, dispatched a constable, who returned an hour later with a small but telling find: a vial of chloroform tucked in a suitcase, and a map of the museum's basement, its edges marked with red wax residue. The discoveries sent a spark through Miss Marple's mind. Lang's ruse was unraveling, his tools of deception laid bare. In the grand hall, the other suspects moved in their orbits of unease. Clara Morton, her brooch glinting as she conferred with a constable, seemed to avoid Lang's gaze, as if sensing his danger. Lord Harrow, pacing near the Sapphire's case, muttered about the scandal, his cane tapping a restless rhythm. Briggs, at his post, watched the room with a scowl, his hand brushing his pocket, a gesture Miss Marple now suspected hid a key or a token of complicity. Lang, however, remained by his pillar, his composure intact, but his eyes darting to the police, betraying a growing unease. Craddock approached, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, "that chloroform's a nasty piece of work. And the map? It shows the cellar passages, marked like a plan. Lang's got some explaining to do." She nodded, her needles clicking. "Indeed, Inspector. A man like Dr. Lang plans carefully, but plans can betray as easily as they conceal." Craddock frowned, sensing her meaning. "You think he's our man?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think, Inspector, that ambition can blind even the cleverest minds, but we must be sure." Her thoughts turned to the tapestry, the note as a lure, the wax as a signature, the chloroform as a tool, the map as a guide. Lang's motive, securing the twin star for his museum, fit the pattern, but Clara's ambition, Harrow's secrecy, and Briggs's grudge remained threads to be woven. Had Lang acted alone or enlisted another's aid? The oiled service door suggested an accomplice, perhaps Briggs, whose debts made him vulnerable. People, she mused, are so very eager to outwit themselves. As dawn's light crept through the museum's windows, Miss Marple sat, her knitting a steady anchor, her mind tracing the final threads. Lang's ruse, she felt certain, was the heart of the mystery, but the truth required one last step to be revealed. Chapter 11. The Trapdoor Trail. The Ashford Museum, now bathed in the pale light of dawn, stood as a silent witness to the unfolding mystery of Ernest Whitby's disappearance. The grand hall, its chandelier barely flickering, was a tableau of exhaustion and tension, with Inspector Craddock's men moving like shadows through the corridors. The sapphire of serendipity, locked in its glass case, gleamed with an almost defiant serenity, its presence a constant reminder of the stakes at play. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner near the marble bust, her knitting needles tracing their steady rhythm, felt the threads of the case converging. The crumpled note with VL, the red wax shard, the navy wool thread, the trapdoor in the vaults, Clara Morton's whispered confession, Lord Harrow's guarded disdain, Tom Briggs's simmering grudge, the oiled service door, and the damning evidence from Dr. Victor Lang's hotel room, a vial of chloroform, and a map of the museum's basement. The rumor of the sapphire's twin, a lost gem tied to a tangled past, was the linchpin, and Miss Marple sensed the truth was close, hidden in the motives and missteps of those around her. The trapdoor in the vaults, discovered beneath a crate, had become her focus. Its slightly ajar edge and the scuff mark nearby suggested a path not yet fully explored, a secret passage that could lead to Whitby, or his captor. Miss Marple, her shawl adjusted to maintain her air of harmless curiosity, approached Inspector Craddock as he conferred with a sergeant near the exhibit hall. His face, etched with the strain of a sleepless night, brightened slightly at her approach. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice heavy, "we're at a dead end. The cellar passages are a maze, and we've found nothing but dust. Any thoughts?" She tilted her head, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Inspector, I wonder if we might revisit that trapdoor. It seems to me a man doesn't vanish without a trail, and trails often lead downward. Craddock, trusting her instincts, nodded and gathered a small team, including 2 constables and a torch-bearing sergeant. Miss Marple, with his reluctant permission, followed, her steps careful on the narrow staircase leading to the vaults. The air grew colder, the scent of dust and old stone sharpening as they descended. The trapdoor, now fully exposed, revealed a steep staircase plunging into darkness, its steps worn smooth by time. Craddock, his torch casting a flickering glow, led the way, his men close behind. Miss Marple, trailing at a discreet distance, noted the faint scuff marks on the steps, as if someone had passed recently, perhaps in haste. The passage below was a warren of low-ceilinged tunnels, remnants of the museum's days as a manor house. Cobwebs draped the walls, and the air was thick with the must of neglect. Craddock's men spread out, their torches sweeping across damp stone and forgotten crates. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp, spotted a faint trail in the dust, leading to a narrow alcove half hidden behind a stack of barrels. "Inspector," she called softly, pointing to the alcove. Craddock, his brow furrowed, followed her gaze and signaled his men to investigate. There, in the dim light, they found Ernest Whitby, bound and gagged, his spectacles askew, but his eyes wide with relief. He was groggy, his face pale from the effects of chloroform, but alive. Craddock's men untied. Him and a constable fetched water as Whitby struggled to sit, his voice hoarse. "It was Lang," he rasped, his words tumbling out. "He lured me here, said he had proof of the Twin Stars' location. I met him at 9:45, as his note said, but he used something, a cloth over my face. I woke up here." Miss Marple, standing quietly, felt the pieces snap into place. The note with VL, the chloroform vial, the red wax, the map. All pointed to Lang's calculated scheme. Craddock, his notebook open, pressed Whitby for details. "Why, man? What did he want?" Whitby's eyes flickered with fear. "The Twin Star," he said. "I'd traced it to a private collector in London, through old letters in our archives. Lang's museum is failing. He thought he could use my research to find it, claim it for himself. When I refused to help, he said he'd make sure I didn't interfere." Miss Marple nodded, her needles still in her reticule, her mind weaving the final threads. Lang's ambition, fueled by desperation, had driven him to kidnap Whitby, using the trapdoor's hidden passage to conceal his crime. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Inspector, might I suggest a closer look at that alcove? There may be more to find." Craddock, accustomed to her insights, nodded, and the sergeant's torch revealed a small bundle tucked behind a barrel. A cloth, still faintly scented with chloroform, and a single red wax seal, broken but unmistakable. The wax matched the shard from the vaults and the smudge on Whitby's desk, a final signature of Lang's guilt. Miss Marple's eyes met Craddock's, and he gave a grim nod. "Lang's got a lot to answer for," he said, signaling his men to bring Whitby to safety. As they returned to the grand hall, Whitby supported by a constable, Miss Marple considered the other suspects. Clara Morton, her ambition now tempered by relief at Whitby's recovery, had likely been a bystander, her costly brooch perhaps a gift from Harrow to ensure her loyalty. Lord Harrow, his disdain masking fear of exposure, had no direct hand in the kidnapping but guarded the Sapphire's secrets to protect his family's name. Briggs, his grudge fueled by debts and resentment, might have been complicit, perhaps oiling the service door for Lang's use, but his role was secondary. Lang, with his crate, his wax, his chloroform, and his map, was the architect, his ruse undone by Miss Marple's quiet persistence. In the hall, the suspects reacted to Whitby's return. Clara's face softened, her hands clasping in relief. Harrow's bluster faded, his cane still as he muttered about the museum's security. Briggs's scowl deepened, his hand avoiding his pocket, as if sensing scrutiny. Lang, however, was absent, and a constable reported he'd slipped out minutes earlier, claiming a need for air. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Lang's flight was a confession, but he would not escape Craddock's net. Craddock approached, his face a mix of gratitude and exasperation. "Miss Marple, you've done it again. That trapdoor was the key, and you pointed us right to it." She smiled, her expression serene. "People, Inspector, leave trails, even when they think they don't. Dr. Lang was clever, but cleverness can be its own trap." She did not mention the note, the wax, or the thread, now safely in her reticule, their purpose served. The twin star, she suspected, would remain a shadow, its secrets safe for now. But Lang's ambition had unraveled in the light of her scrutiny. As the museum stirred with the first rays of morning, Miss Marple sat, her knitting resumed, her mind at peace. The truth was near, and one final act would bring it to light. People, she mused, are so very predictable, even in their cunning. Chapter 12. The Denouement. The Ashford Museum, bathed in the soft glow of a new day, seemed to exhale as the mystery of Ernest Whitby's disappearance reached its climax. The grand hall, its chandelier now catching the morning light, was a scene of quiet resolution, with Inspector Craddock's men tidying up their notes and the sapphire of serendipity gleaming in its case, a silent witness to the drama's end. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner near the marble bust, her knitting needles moving with their gentle rhythm, surveyed the gathered suspects with a serene clarity. The crumpled note with VL, the red wax shard, the navy wool thread, the trap door in the vaults, Clara Morton's whispered confession, Lord Harrow's guarded disdain, Tom Briggs's simmering grudge, the oiled service door and the damning evidence from Dr. Victor Lang's hotel room, chloroform and a map, had woven a tapestry of truth, its final threads now ready to be tied. Craddock, his face weary but resolute, had apprehended Lang just outside the museum, where he'd been caught attempting to slip away in the dawn's cover. The rival curator, his polished facade cracked, stood now in the grand hall, his wrists bound by a constable's cuffs, his sharp features taut with defiance. Clara Morton, Lord Harrow, and Tom Briggs, summoned by Craddock, formed a tense semicircle around the sapphire's case, their expressions a mix of relief, shame, and unease. Whitby, pale but recovering, sat nearby, a blanket draped over his shoulders, his spectacles glinting as he watched the scene unfold. Miss Marple, invited by Craddock to share her insights, rose, her shawl adjusted, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her eyes sweeping the group, "a museum is a place of preservation, but it seems it can also preserve secrets. Mr. Whitby's disappearance was no accident, but a carefully laid plan, undone by the very human flaws of its maker." She paused, her needles stilled, as Lang's gaze hardened, though he said nothing. "It began with a gem," she continued, nodding toward the sapphire, "but not the one before us. A second sapphire, the twin star, lost decades ago, was Mr. Whitby's obsession. He traced it to a private collector in London, a discovery that threatened more than one person here. She turned to Lang, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Doctor." "Lang, your museum's fortunes were waning, weren't they? The twin star was a prize to restore its glory, and Mr. Whitby's research was your key. You wrote a note, signed VL, luring him to the vaults at 9:45 with a promise of proof. You used chloroform, found in your hotel room, to subdue him and hid him in the cellar's alcove, accessed through a trap door you'd mapped." She produced the crumpled note and red wax shard from her reticule, holding them up. "Your museum's wax, used for sealing letters, betrayed you. Found on Mr. Whitby's desk and near the trap door. A careless habit, Doctor. Lang, for so precise a man." Lang's lips parted, then closed, his eyes blazing. "You've no proof," he said, his voice low. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The map in your room, marked with that same wax, and the chloroform vial speak loudly enough. You planned to extract Mr. Whitby's findings, perhaps to claim the twin star. But when he refused, you silenced him, hoping to pin the blame on another." She glanced at Clara, whose face paled, her costly brooch glinting. "Miss Morton," Miss Marple said, "your ambition was clear, and that brooch suggests a generosity beyond your means. I suspect Lord Harrow gifted it, hoping to secure your silence about his family's tangled history with the sapphire." Clara's hands twisted, but she nodded, her voice small. He gave it to me last week, said it was a bonus. I didn't know about the kidnapping." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ambition blinds, my dear, but you were not the villain here." She turned to Harrow, whose cane was still, his face ashen. "Lord Harrow, your disdain hid fear. The twin star's existence, tied to your ancestors' dealings, could tarnish your legacy. You knew of Mr. Whitby's research, didn't you? Your absence during the gala was no mere cigar break." Harrow's jaw tightened, but he spoke, his voice low. "I wanted him to stop digging. I spoke to him, yes, but I didn't harm him." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you, though secrets are heavy burdens." Finally, she faced Briggs, whose scowl had deepened. "Mr. Briggs, your grudge against Mr. Whitby was known, and your debts made you vulnerable. The oiled service door suggests you aided Dr. Lang, perhaps unknowingly, by ensuring access." Briggs's hand froze near his pocket, where Miss Marple suspected a key lay. "I didn't touch him," he muttered. "Lang asked me to leave the door unlocked, said it was for deliveries. I needed the money." Miss Marple's gaze was kind but firm. "A small act, Mr. Briggs, but it enabled a larger crime." Lang, cornered, broke his silence, his voice a snarl. "Whitby was a fool, hoarding knowledge he wouldn't share. My museum deserved that gem." His outburst faded as Craddock signaled his men to lead him away. Clara, chastened, promised to assist Whitby fully. Harrow, subdued, pledged funds for better security, his pride humbled. Briggs, admitting to minor thefts unrelated to the kidnapping, faced a lesser charge, but a heavy conscience. As the hall emptied, Craddock approached Miss Marple, his notebook closed. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple," he said, a wry smile breaking through his fatigue. "That trapdoor and wax, I'd have missed them." She smiled, her needles resuming. "Human nature, Inspector, is rarely a mystery when you look closely. People weave their own traps." She glanced at the sapphire, its twin still a shadow, its secrets safe for now. Returning to her knitting, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, the museum's silence a testament to truth restored,